Book 3, God's Singer, Chapter 3, The Portiuncula Indulgence. It is first of all necessary to observe that the Church of Rome, previous to the establishment of the Portiuncula Indulgence, had only one plenary indulgence, the one granted to those who took up the cross and joined the ranks of the Crusaders. Everyone who did this and fulfilled the requirements of confessing his sins and obtained absolution from a priest, obtained complete remission of the Church's penances, as well as of the punishment of purgatory, so that his soul could appear before God directly after death. This indulgence of the Crusade, Indulgentia de Terra Sancta, was later extended so as to apply to anyone who, for one reason or another, did not personally join the ranks of the Crusaders, but with money or with armed men sustained the holy war. It was also the Franciscans, something which in this connection is of the greatest importance, who obtained from the Pope the right of distributing this indulgence, extended as above stated. Whenever the Church decreed an indulgence in other cases, as on the consecration of a church, it was done in a distinctively different form. The Lateran Council of 1215 had imposed further restrictions on this custom. On the consecration of a church, the Council decreed, an indulgence of only 1 year canonical penance should be granted, and on the recurring anniversaries of the consecration, only one of 40 days. At the consecration of the church of Saint Francis in Assisi, there was granted as something quite extraordinary an indulgence of 3 years to all who had come over the sea to take part in the festival, and of 2 years to those who had crossed the Alps, while the ordinary pilgrim had to be content with the usual indulgence of 1 year. What is it then that Francis, in contrast to this, tried to get from the Pope, or better, did obtain from him? If we give credence to the authorities, he presented himself one fine day, accompanied by Brother Maceo of Marignano, before Honorius II, and begged for the Portiuncula Church the same indulgence granted to the Crusaders in the Holy Lands. "I desire," he is said to have announced to the Pope, "that everyone who, with penitence for his sins, comes into this church and confesses his sins and is absolved by the priest, shall be free from all guilt and punishment for the sins of his life from the day of his baptism to the day when he entered the said church." It was in vain that the Pope urged that the Roman Curia was not accustomed to grant such indulgences to any church. It was vain that he offered to Francis one of the ordinary indulgences. Francis could not be moved, as he declared that the Lord Himself had sent him in order to obtain this indulgence. Then the Pope suddenly, as if by the divine guidance, yielded the point, and now it remained to the cardinals, as Honorius depicted the injury it might do to the indulgence of the Crusade, to restrict the new indulgence. It was to be valid for only 1 day in each year, from the vespers of the evening before through the full 24 hours following until sunset. Francis departed contented, and when the Pope asked him if he did not want a written authorization, he said it was superfluous, for God will know how to bring His own work into the light. With this relation for a foundation, a group of legends has been built up, to which belong the Rose legend, depicted by Overbeck on the facade of the Portiuncula Chapel. These adornments of the recital first appear in works of the 14th century. What is given above can be referred to earlier sources. At the first glance, this narration seems very probable in itself. Every biographer of Francis tells us how he loved his dear Portiuncula, and we also know how zealous he was for the conversion of sinners. He once saw in a vision how men from all places, near and far, came in streams around the little Portiuncula, and one of his disciples had a similar vision. Again, the dislike of documents is a characteristic of Francis. In 1210 he was satisfied with the verbal ratification of Innocent III, and at the Lateran Council he got nothing more. When Orlando dei Catani gave him Laverna, this too was done without any writing, as it is explicitly stated in the letter of gifts of the young Count Catani in 1274. In his testament, Francis forbids most definitely his brothers to seek written privileges from the Curia, whether for a church or for any other place. It is perfectly clear that such an answer as Francis gave to Honorius, according to the old story, is quite in the spirit of Saint Francis. It is quite another question if Francis really gave this answer, in other words, if such an interview ever took place. First and foremost, we must here remark that none of the undoubtedly authentic authorities of the 13th century contain a single reference to the Portiuncula Indulgence. Thomas of Celano knows the indulgence which Gregory IX granted to the Church of Saint Francis in Assisi, but neither he nor the old biographers of Saint Francis have the least inkling of the existence of the Portiuncula Indulgence. It is only much more recent authorities who assert that this indulgence could be gained every year since 1216 on days appointed by Honorius III, namely from the evening of August the 1st to the evening of the 2nd. This remarkable silence of the official biographers may be regarded as the sequence of the non-existing papal bull, or as a result of the opposition of Elias of Cortona and of his party to the Portiuncula men, the strict division of the order. The biographers in question had to serve the party in power. If this was the correct conclusion, on the other hand, we should expect to find the Portiuncula Indulgence in the place of honor in the legend originating in the ranks of the strict division, as in the Speculum Perfectionis or in the Fioretti. But it is in vain that one looks even here for a trace of the legend given above. The tradition of the indulgence naturally can be referred, if not in the direct, then in the secondary line, to Brother Leo and the other intimate friends of Saint Francis. And in the first rank stands the testimony taken in the presence of numerous witnesses on October 31st, 1277, and signed by a notary public in Arezzo, as given by two Franciscans, Brother Benedict of Arezzo, who formerly was with St. Francis when he still lived, and Brother Rayner of Arezzo, who declared himself a confidential friend of Brother Maceo from Marignano. In this document, the two Franciscans testify that they had heard from Brother Maceo, who was the truth itself, how he and Francis went together to Perugia, and obtained from Pope Honorius the above described indulgence, although the Pope said that the Apostolic Throne was not one to give such an indulgence. The recital is very short, and the document is provided with a date which is quite complete and in all particulars correct. The original is no longer in existence. Sabatier maintains that one of the copies now in Assisi dates from the end of the 13th century. Various other recitals of the same period rest upon the testimony of Brother Maceo through the intermediary of Brother Benedict of Arezzo. Sabatier has inserted them in his edition of Francesco Bartoli's book on the Portiuncula Indulgence of about 1435. But if they originate with Brother John of Laverna, or with Brother Otto of Acquasparta, they contain nothing new. It is only a new appearance of the original source, Maceo Benedict, which we find in various places. That an old man, Pietro Zalfani, in his youth claims to have been present at the consecration of the Portiuncula Church, and that he says that he there saw Francis standing with a paper in his hand, amounts to but little. Another group of witnesses of about the same time depends upon Brother Leo instead of Brother Maceo. A nobleman of Perugia, Jacopo Copoli, who on February 14, 1276, gave the Perugian Franciscans the hill on which their old convent, Monte Ripido, stands, testifies at about this same time, and in a similar form to that of Brother Benedict of Arezzo, that he had heard Brother Leo tell about the Portiuncula Indulgence. In the narration of Coppoli, the Pope offers to Francis an indulgence of 7 years without satisfying him. He then offered the indulgence de terra sancta, but the cardinals caused him to limit it. After Francis had told this to Brother Leo, he told him to say nothing of the indulgence for the present, for this indulgence shall remain hidden for a while. The Lord will in good time bring it out and reveal it. Wadding places, and certainly correctly, this testimony in the year 1277. This was 2 generations after the granting of the indulgence. It is clear that within the order, or rather within its stricter party, to which Benedict of Arezzo belonged, the effort was made, first as strongly as possible, to prove the existence of the Portiuncula Indulgence, and secondly, to explain why the indulgence was not announced sooner. For this reason, Brother Benedict had his testimony affirmed by a notary, and Jacob Coppoli's testimony was given in the presence of numerous witnesses before the provincial minister for Umbria, Brother Angelo, 1270–1280. It was also about this time, or a little earlier, that Brother Francis of Fabriano obtained himself the Portiuncula Indulgence, and he tells also that he received from Brother Leo the tale of how Francis obtained it from the Pope. It is definitely certain that Francis of Fabriano wrote the work to which we refer in his later years, for he quotes a document which at the earliest may be of 1310. Brother Francis, who was born in 1251 and died in 1322, was 60 or 70 years old when he put down his reminiscences. There is no reason to doubt that Francis of Fabriano was in Portiuncula in the year referred to. We cannot set aside the explanation that in his advanced age he may have had the indulgence as the object of his pilgrimage. From the beginning, many Franciscans made the pilgrimage to the grave of their spiritual father and to Portiuncula, and in this connection it is of the greatest significance that Pope Nicholas IV, himself a Franciscan, speaks in a letter of May 14, 1284, of the numerous crowd of brothers who streamed to Assisi, but never names the Portiuncula Indulgence as the reason of their going. According to this Pope, the Church of San Francesco, containing the saint's tomb, as well as the Portiuncula Chapel, were the objects of pilgrimage and not the indulgence, all being done to honor the saint. This accords with the fact that Angela of Foligno, 1248–1309, soon after she entered the Third Order of Saint Francis, made a pilgrimage to Assisi, but on this occasion never speaks of Portiuncula, but tells of 2 visits to the memorial church of San Francesco. And she is known to have been of the strict observance. The great chief of this party, Hubert of Casale, visited her shortly before her death, and speaks of her in the prologue to his Arbor Vitae with the greatest reverence. Naturally, Angela's visit to Assisi may have fallen in a time of the year when the indulgence was not to be obtained. She may have not been there on the 1st or 2nd day of August. Still, it is strange that she never says a word about Portiuncula. Everything indicates that the Portiuncula Indulgence first began to be known only in the last quarter, in the last third, if we accept Francis of Fabriano's words, of the 13th century. If it were allowable to apply modern conceptions to the ways of those days, we might be tempted to place the origin of the indulgence at the 50-year jubilee of the granting of the indulgence, 1212–1264. Francis of Fabriano's visit was made in 1268. It is certain that as soon as the indulgence became known, it awakened opposition. Hence the notarial declarations of Benedict of Arezzo, Rainier, Copoli, Zolfani, even the great leaders of the strict Franciscan observance, Peter John Olivi, 1248 to 1298, took up the question of the indulgence. In a small, unfortunately undated pamphlet, he strives to uphold its authenticity, first on dogmatic and then on historic grounds. Unfortunately, the historic portion is lost. It is not to be wondered at that in this dispute several Catholic investigators doubted or even denied the origin of the indulgence to have been with Saint Francis, so inadequately is it proved. Even the author of this book was once of the same opinion, and so expressed himself in the first edition of the same. According to my views at that time, the Portiuncula Indulgence was only a localized indulgence de terra sancta, or Crusaders' indulgence. Thus, when the Holy Land was lost, Saint Jean d'Acre fell 1291, being the last stronghold of the Christians. The indulgence of the Crusade, which the Pope had permitted the Franciscans to share, could only be obtained in Portiuncula. It was natural that the 2nd of August should be chosen as the day for granting the indulgence, as this was the anniversary of the consecration of the Church. Such a choice was not un-Franciscan. On August the 1st is celebrated the festival of St. Peter's Chains. Francis of Assisi's reverence for the saint was well known, and in the Mass of this day in the Collect is this passage: O God, who didst let the blessed Peter the Apostle depart free and uninjured from his bonds, we beg Thee to free us from the bonds of our sins. In the little Portiuncula chapel, the new Terra Sancta, the Franciscans, by virtue of the authorization already obtained, shared on these days the same plenary indulgence which formerly belonged to the Crusaders, and led penitent pilgrims out of the valley of sin and punishment into the Holy Land of innocence. In the 4 years which have passed since this chapter in my book was written, a most meritorious investigator of Franciscan history, Reverend Herbert Holzapfel in Munich, has developed new viewpoints for the consideration of this question. Father Holzapfel agrees that in the lifetime of St. Francis, the indulgence in question was little known and little used. It must impress us, he writes, that all later authorities only mention the fact that the indulgence was secured by St. Francis, but never say that it was much frequented either in the lifetime of the saint nor during the first decade following his death. Some causes must then have been operative which, in the beginning at least, hindered the dissemination of the indulgence. In seeking these causes we are driven into the region of conjecture. I may be permitted to suggest the following solution for discussion. The Pope conceded the indulgence only after long persuasion. As we learn from later authorities, the cardinals were decided enemies of the proposition, as were the bishops of the vicinity, that is, in Assisi, Foligno, Perugia, Gubbio, etc. These bishops, says Father Holzapfel, did not wish such an extraordinary demonstration of favor for the insignificant Portiuncula chapel, and expressed themselves to St. Francis on the subject in various ways, and the more as they doubtless knew the feeling of the Curia. It would be in exact accord with the spirit of St. Francis that he would remain silent from his reverence for the priesthood. His was no combative nature, and here, as in other instances, yielded. That he did it willingly we do not assert. It may have hurt him, like many another thing that he had to yield to and could not change. He will have spoken also of the disappointment with his trusted companions. He will have comforted himself with the prospects of a better future, and have exhorted them for the present to practice patient submission. This does not exclude the possibility that the few friars sharing his knowledge or similar people in the world may have used the indulgence as granted, only we must not think of a wide dissemination of it. The circle of those knowing of it would grow with time, and consequently the frequentation of the Indulgence, but also the opposition of its enemies. Then the friars who were still living felt it their duty to leave authentic proof of what they knew so well. They need fear no longer the enmity of the Curia, which was very friendly to the order, nor the enmity of the bishops, at least not of the directly interested bishops of Assisi, who for some time had been Franciscans. This hypothesis explains the silence of the biographers. If, moreover, the Speculum Perfectionis, which was written in the year 1318, when the Indulgence was perfectly known on all sides, never mentions it, why should the silence of the early biographers prove anything against the existence of the Indulgence at the period when they wrote? As in so many other questions of Franciscan investigation, we here have to refer to approved authorities of the olden times. End of Book 3, Chapter 3.